Welcome to Concrete Conversations, the Indian Real Estate Podcast. All over the world, we are seeing climate change impact people's lives and livelihoods and set a concerning trend for the future. The scope and complexity of the problem is massive, and potential solutions are often hard to implement. However, we do know that renewable energy, circular economies, and sustainable practices all play a role, and that corporations, governments, and the general public are all stakeholders here. To talk to us about the interconnectedness of real estate and climate change, we have with us today Ms. Tanya Singhal, an industry expert with over 15 years of experience in the climate technology and renewable energy sector. An IIT alumnus, Ms. Singhal's professional journey began with Boston Consulting Group, but soon transitioned to entrepreneurship with her founding SolarArise, a solar asset management company. During her tenure at SolarArise, the company was responsible for developing over half a gigawatt of solar projects across 7 states in India, and eventually went on to be listed on the London Stock Exchange. Today, Ms. Singhal has embarked on a new mission with Mynzo Carbon, which stands for My Net Zero. Mynzo leverages technology to automatically measure emissions, create individual climate identities, and provide personalized nudges for reducing carbon footprints. The vision extends further with My Forest, a project aimed at carbon recapture to achieve net zero emissions. In today's episode, we talk about the change in the renewable energy market in India, the various stakeholders when it comes to climate action, and how each of them can play their part in helping mitigate this problem.
So, hi Tanya. Thank you for joining us here today on Concrete Conversations. We hope you're having a good day. Usually, we like to start our conversations by getting to know our guests a little better, a little bit about their journey with their work, how they got to where they are today. So, if you could just give us, a brief summary of what you do right now and how you got here.
Sure. Thank you, Yash and Akshay. I'm very happy to be here as a part of Concrete Conversation. And a very warm welcome and hello to all the audiences. Well, very quickly about me, I am an entrepreneur in the renewable energy and the climate tech space for over 2 decades now. I started my journey when, after IIT, I went to BCG, the Boston Consulting Group. And for 4 years, I did a study there on mega trends about the future. And one of the big mega trend that came was solar energy. And at that time, and I'm talking of a 2009 era, when there was actually no solar policy in India, solar prices were like 18, 19 rupees a unit, almost 4 times the price of coal.
Wow.
We predicted that solar will be cheaper than coal by 2020. And I was like very convinced with my data analytics. And as a consultant, I took it to everybody and said, you should do this. This is what is the call of the day. And unfortunately, everybody just shoved me away like this is a consultant with her analysis. What do I do with that? And I think that's when something changed in me. And it was triggered again when somebody showed me a map of India and covered a small box on the Thar Desert and said 7% of the Thar is enough to power the whole of India. And I was like, what am I doing? I have this engineering degree. I'm helping coal companies make millions. And that's something which changed. And in 2010, I left BCG. I started my entrepreneurial journey in solar. As I sit today, a decade later, a lot has happened. First of all, we built about a half a gigawatt solar portfolio across India. I have 7 plants all over different states, and these plants power about 250,000 homes. Absorb about 600,000 kg CO2 every year out of the year. And very proudly, I achieved my vision of making solar cheaper than India 5 years earlier than my target in 2015 is vis-a-vis 2020 that we had predicted then, and nobody had believed. And last year, we also proved that solar is not like a CSR solution or something that is just a good to have, but an economic proposition. When we listed our assets on the London Stock Exchange and got a return exit for our investors who believed in us and got multiples on their investment, and now showing that solar is a public market instrument where people can take a lot. So very long journey to make marginal sector into a big reality. After that, for some time I thought that I've done in life, and now I just taken only retirement. But I think for people like you and me, that is not a option. So I still felt that there's a lot to be done in climate change, and what you need is individuals to take part, because while solar is a very big thing and it's going to change the way we consume energy, nothing will happen unless this becomes something like a coffee conversation, something we talk about daily, and then a part of our daily lives, right? And that's where I started Minzo, my net zero, which is about driving climate consciousness in the masses and making it more automatic as a part of your life. And that's where I am. It's a very old long term problem, but taking a different crack with technology and AI on that. So that's broadly me.
Right. And a couple of things that you said sort of stood out and flow well into one of the next questions that we had for you. You said that the perception has changed of solar, for example, from it being a CSR outlay versus something that can actually bring return to investors as well. And also the importance of individual action. So that just, made me think about, are there any other such common misconceptions when it comes to climate action or the industry working on, renewable energy or solutions like that that you think are worth addressing right now?
Sure. I think there are more misconceptions than reality in general public about it. And one of the biggest ones I hear is, oh, climate change, that is for the future. Why do I
Hmm.
need to worry? In
Hmm.
my lifetime or my kids' lifetime, this is not something I'm going to see. And the unfortunate fact is last year we breached the 1.5 degree
Yeah.
threshold
Yeah.
where the scientists said that this is like a big mark. And now we're no longer changing 1.5, we're changing 2 degrees.
Hmm.
So that's one of the biggest things. The other thing I hear a lot, which people say is, "Mere se kya hoga? How can I do climate change or anything
Right.
in this thing? This is something for the governments or for big companies. This is not for you and me. It's not for common man." And that I think is the biggest misconception. When people stop believing that their actions matter, it is the biggest problem. In climate change, small is big. And
Right.
that's what people need to realize. This is not something that will happen in the next universe. This is happening now. It will not just impact our kids, it will impact us in our old age. There are a lot of other things I can keep going. People think climate change is just about temperature rise. Where I have 40 degree, I'll have 40.5 degree, half a degree se kya ho jayega, right? You don't realize that that half a degree can create havocs. It'll get melt solar, it can melt ice caps, can create floods, cyclones, like you name it and you'll have it. And you can see it now happening in our daily lives.
Right.
I like the fact that you brought up this idea of like small change contributes to a greater good, because I recently saw a video about the Mithi River in Mumbai where they did a cleanup drive. In 22 to 24 they showed the contrast, and you can see sandy beaches along the riverside where you saw beaches of just plastic bottles and trash. So it definitely can make a big difference on an individual level, and with that in mind I thought maybe we can talk a little bit about who are the key stakeholders that can drive positive action for climate change. Obviously we have corporations, we have governments, we have individuals. How do you see the interplay of these working and driving for positive action?
Sure, Akshay, that's a great question. And I think what's very important to understand here is that climate change is about collaborative action. It is a collective, joint effort. Sometimes people think of key stakeholders as like this one person or this one agency or this one entity can drive it and that's it. But climate change, unfortunately, is not that. It has happened because of all of us. All the human being as a race has created it. So we together only can change it. Governments have to come together to create the right policies, regulations, to ensure that there's a stick. Businesses have to be conscious, see about their emissions, whether they're scope 1, 2, 3, and drive it across their business. Individuals like you and me have to see our daily actions in not just what we do in our lives, but in terms of how we run our jobs and our business and decisions we take there as employees. NGOs have a part in terms of educating the masses. Schools have a very big part in teaching the next generation and making this as a part of your base lifestyle as you grow. Because the next, our leaders are going to be the youth today, and they need to understand it more. So I wouldn't say this is like one party that is critical for it. It is a collective action that needs to bring multiple people together, because it doesn't impact one person but all of us together, because there's no other planet, there is only Earth. There is no planet backup plan B. I know Mr. Musk can take us to the moon and all of that, but well, I like Earth and I want to be here. So
Before we move on, actually, you touched upon scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So I just thought, if for our listeners who are not familiar with exactly what that means, if you could just quickly
sure.
explain 1, 2, and 3.
Sure, sure. It's very simple. Scope one is something that I directly as a business emit. So, say I have an industry, I have a boiler. So, whatever that will emit, or whatever my fleet will emit, anything that is directly attributable to my business is scope one. Scope two is anything that I indirectly do, but in terms of electricity consumption. So, all the electricity that my factories will take, whether it's coming from the grid, whether it's coal, whether it's solar, the impact because of that. Scope 3 is everything else. It's like that others, which sits in the
Right.
balance sheet, but it ends up taking 95 to 90% of your emissions. And that's the most difficult part. You will not believe scope 3 has 17 categories within it, right? It
Wow.
has
Right.
upstream emissions, downstream emissions. So upstreams mean that when I procure my raw material, emissions because of that. Downstream is when I've made my good, selling that, emissions because of that, emissions because of my employees, doing my business. So there's a huge change, but simply scope one, direct because of me as my business. Scope two, electricity I consume. Scope three, everything else, upstream, downstream, my employees.
Perfect. And I think that leads into another question here, which is, um, obviously, given the definitions you've just told us about scope 1, 2, and 3, there will be a difference between these different stakeholders, whether it's corporations or individuals, in terms of the kind of impact that they can have as well. So, with that in mind, what is the division of, responsibility one and impact as well between these different stakeholders? And can any of them, have an outsized impact when it comes to this?
Sure. So, in terms of impact, I will break it into where action can make change and where you need resources. Okay. So, first, I want to clarify a misconception that if there is a large view that climate change or sustainability or being environmentally friendly is a cost center.
Right.
People believe ki I will have to spend to do this. But the reality is the three basic R's that stand behind is reduce, reuse, and recycle, which by default means consume less or reconsume, which is about saving. So, climate change is not a cost center. It's about being actually more economical, and it's a profit center. It may entail some investment to start with, right? So, but you don't have to look at it in a point in time. You have to look at it as a long term horizon, that, oh, for my investment cycle in the 10-year period or in 15-year period, what is my rate of return, or on this investment?
Right.
And that's where you realize it's a positive change. As soon as you start seeing this that way, the impact of different stakeholders becomes much more meaningful, right? So, for example, for the government, they can then invest a lot into specific technologies, whether it's procuring through renewable or through making green buildings and stuff like that. Same is for businesses, right? Even for individuals, as they see is, okay, what do I do for myself, right? Some solutions will be immediate and small. Oh, I will not carry disposable plastics with me. I'll just take a bag, like my parents used to do all that ages before, and now it's gone away, right? Or it can be big efforts to say, I will install a rooftop solution, right? So the nature changes, but like I said before, each small activity adds up. This is a typical place where you say बूंद बूंद से भरता सागर.
Mhm.
So these small actions make a cumulative impact. You can't pinpoint and say, oh, you know what, today the government launched this net zero by 2070, so this is the biggest thing, or this Google did to got the scope 3 as zero, so this is the biggest thing. Because one of them is not gonna be the maker or breaker. Together we all will be. And together, if you think, oh, my action is small, theirs is bigger, so let them do it, let me step back,
Mhm.
that's when we have lost the battle.
Right.
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 I wanted to talk to you about the same idea. We talk about investment and return, and I'm segueing here a little bit because I know your previous company listed on the London Stock Exchange, um, and I want to talk about just an investment perspective. We see a lot of talk about sustainability, sustainable investments in the West, especially Western economical market, Western stock
Mhm.
markets, and in the Western investor conversation. We see some of that coming into the conversation in India as well, not as much of a scale perhaps, or it's a little sort of behind in terms of where the conversation is in the West. One of the ideas that we talk about is, like you said, like for a business, investing in sustainability is a cost. The misconception is that it's a cost center when actually it's an investment in the long term returns. The same way we talk about, when you invest in stocks, where there's a risk and return trade off. There's now a conversation about a sustainability return trade off. So I just wanted to get your thoughts about businesses that are gearing themselves for do with sustainability. How do you see this return versus sustainability trade off playing out in the short term, in the long term? Where do you feel the importance of this conversation comes into play, even for
Sure,
individual investors?
sure. So, you said multiple things. Let me focus on
Sorry.
two aspects of it. One is investment in India vis-a-vis the West, and the second is the investment's impact was on short, mid, vis-a-vis long. Okay. So, for the first one, I would say that the trend has been on a very big upward rise in terms of investment in sustainability, whether it's renewable as an investment field or
Mm,
sustainable practices, and has drastically gone up in India in the last 5 years. In solar per se, in the last decade, we have actually become in the top five in the world from
mm,
being non existent on the map.
mm,
So that trend is changing. Today, as you sit, almost 40% of the Indian grid is coming from renewable energy, and our
mm, right.
target is to get it to 50% by 2030. So you're not like far away or far off. So
Mm-hmm.
there is a very big delta and movement, a very positive momentum happening here. And this is purely driven by the fact that this is an economic solution, and the value proposition sits inside the economic model. It's not driven by any subsidies. And
Right.
taking hard facts on solar per se, today you can generate solar power on a large scale anywhere between 3 to 3.5 rupees a unit,
Wow.
flat for 25 years.
Hmm. Hmm.
For the listeners, to give them a perspective, coal plants today
Mm,
generate power at 4.5 rupees, which have a 3.5% inflation every year. So one where I'm talking of 3 rupee flat power, the other place I'm talking of a 4.5 rupee escalating power. So
mm,
imagine sitting in 2050 and getting a flat 3 rupee solar power. That is where you are today.
Right.
So that's the first point I would like to talk about in terms of investment
mm-hmm.
potential and where you are. Linking that to returns, I would feel that sustainability is something where if you want to look at the returns in a very short term, you would typically not see it, because the cycle is more like a big down, small cash flows in the start, then it starts to grow, and then when your capital has come back is when you see big peaks.
Right.
So it's like a big red and like a peak like this.
Right.
So it's your mid to long term where you see your maximum returns. Taking solar as an example, it is something like a debt instrument, like a fixed income bond now, where a
Mm-hmm.
lot of pension funds are investing, right? And you will get anywhere like a double digit kind of return. First few years will be slower, low single digit.
Mm-hmm.
Mid years will get to a high single digit, and then future year will be the like highest 20% kind of things, which gives this blended return.
Mhm.
So that's the profile, and that's true for businesses as well who invest in sustainability. First few years is more like you put in, you build the system up, you get gear the system, and after 3-4 years it starts churning its returns, and then your capital comes back, and then it's like free money, right?
Right.
So that's how you should think about it. If you want to invest in something like, I want my return in 1 year, I want my return in 2 years,
Mhm.
then sustainability will not make sense. But you didn't reach here in 1 or 2 years, right? You reached here in decades.
Yeah.
So to unturn it also, it will take decades. But the limited point is, this is not a cost center, it's a profit center.
Right.
Look at it in a long term vision, and you will want to do it for your business.
I just wanted to make an observation based on what Tanya was saying. It's a question of capacity building also, I think. And solar is one of the few industries where I've observed a linear, if not exponential, decay in the price per unit over
Mhm.
like the last 15 years. So I think that's an important point to make, that it is a profit center in the long run. It's also a question of capacity building and you reaping the benefits of that in your business model over the long run.
So I'll take an example there. Solar, for example, took this long time to get there, but it's still daytime power, right? I only get power when the sun shines. But I still need to run my ACs at night. So how do I? You'll say, "Oh, that's great. You're saying solar, but what do I do? I still need coal there." That's where today storage technology is coming in. Now,
Right.
storage is where solar was 10 years ago, but its advancement is way faster. And we are predicting today that in 3 to 4 years, you will be able to get flat 24-hour stored green power at sub 5 rupees. And that's when you'll have a revolution. Imagine 24-hour abundant 5 rupee power, as much as you want to use, because there is the sun and the wind is free, always there. Land in India is not a constraint. It is just about putting the capital investment. These projects don't take more than a year and a half to come up. It's not like a coal or a nuclear plant that'll take you like 3 to 4 years to build. And then you have so much power that you will be like, okay, let's pump it up.
Hmm.
So that's what a revolution is waiting to happen in this space.
Right. I think the fact that you mentioned land is not a constraint is also important, because a lot of these, especially when you talk about solar and wind and some other renewable techs, a lot of the locations where you would develop these farms or these harvesting centers for this type of energy is not really real estate where you'd have human civilization inhabiting residential real estate per
Yeah.
se. So
So
it's
most of my
definitely.
plants are like 8 to 9 hours from the nearest airport. People think that real estate is a big part. You will be amazed that land is not more than 2 to 3% of my overall capital cost in a plant. Right? This is like land middle of nowhere, uninhabited, just hard, no life in terms of trees, bushes. This thing, it's just lying there.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right.
I also think this brings up an interesting like second angle to the conversation, because I liked how you would, and I know I have a personal opinion. I'm sure Yash has his own opinion about this, but I would love to hear yours first before we share ours. Um, there's this idea in the conversation about climate change, sustainability, that this conversation has started in the West, where developed nations are talking about sustainability and climate change, and there's pressure on developing nations who are trying to economically catch up to also make these changes while trying to make up the economy gap. Um, I I know what I think about that train of thought, but I'm curious to know what you think about that train of thought before we discuss our views. I want to add to the fact that the reason I'm bringing this up is because you mentioned how 40% of energy supply in India today is done with renewables. So I think that adds a huge context to this conversation.
Sure. So, actually, my specific views, before I go on here, let's talk about what happened at the COP28, right? I think that's the global conversation, making it clear and real that it's an agenda where one set of nations who are developed are pushing the other set of nations to say, let's do something. And it's become a concept, a question of language and vocabulary, right? From phase out coal to phase down coal, which is the reality of developing nations. Like I said, today, storage is not that cheap. I still need nighttime power as a developing economy, right? So what do? I stop growing? No. I need to cover that gap through conventional sources, whether I like it or not. But I have the strongest path to reach a place where I can power the grid in a majority basis by clean energy, despite growing as an economy. For developed nations, they should not have this constraint. Why are they backing behind the excuse of a developing nation to get behind it? If you compare the per capita emissions of West, the US and UK, it's almost like 16, 17 tons per person per year. Whereas in India, that number is like low single digit. Again, and that's because there's a large rural population in India. Even if you ignore that rural population and think I say I only take the urban Indian population, then also it's not even half to two-thirds of what you get in the West. So, but having said that, it doesn't matter you are good or I am bad. It's like you're sitting in a boat. There's a hole on the other side of the boat. Water is coming from the other side of the boat, and you are listening and you're laughing there. Ah, your side of the boat is getting water, but you don't realize you are in the same boat. It's the other side getting water, but you will drown in it as well. So whether you're developed, developing, underdeveloped, you all have to work together, right? You can point fingers to anything, but at the end of the day, it's one Earth, one planet, and that's where I love the slogan coined for G20, right? On bringing this together. It's one. It's we have to do this together.
Now that we've kind of defined the problem space here, and in what the structures are, who the stakeholders are, I think the next step, or the next logical step in this conversation, is to ask you about Minzo, and what is Minzo doing in terms of interventions, right? Because again, there's so many different stakeholders, there's so much interplay here also between the impact of these stakeholders. So how does Minzo work to address these sort of things?
Sure. So Minzo stands for My Net Zero. It's about getting each business, each individual to net zero. The first point about getting to net zero is knowing your footprint. Like, let me ask you, Yash, or let me ask you, Akshay. Do you know how much carbon you emit? And you are climately conscious people.
I'm very conscious of answering because I'm currently living in the West. So
So my point is that for people like you who are actually evolved in their climate thinking, if you don't know what you emit, how can you reduce something you don't know? Right, and that's the core standing point behind Minzo. It helps individuals and corporates to first measure their emissions. But measurement cannot be an intrusive thing which is very intensive and you need to jot down everything every 5 minutes of your life, because as soon as you do that, you have lost the person after the initial enthusiasm, right? So it has to be something very automatic. And what better than your phone, which actually is with you with most of your time, to capture your activities and automatically convert it into your emissions data, right? Using the Internet of Things and AI to kind of learn from your activities and using a full library to convert those activities into emissions. Like it automatically detects I flew, it automatically detects I was sitting in a car, right? And
Okay, right.
it'll learn about your behavior and your habits and it'll create your carbon footprint. So today at Minzo, we are starting mainly with your activities and your electricity consumption. Later, we'll add purchases. But what you have today is completely unintrusive. So we built your carbon climate identity first, automatically, with you spending not more than 2 minutes of your time. Maybe correct one odd activity so that the AI learns. Then, based on that, we give you tailor made nudges to say, you know what, Yash, your home is very close to office. Why don't you actually some days work from office? Your footprint will come down. We say for you, Akshay, you travel really a long distance to go to office. Why don't you just work out of home? So every individual is unique, so their actions need to be unique, and your data can guide you that the best. And that's the second and the most important thing Ninja does, is to nudge you to reduce. But unfortunately, like you just said, as you develop, you grow, there's only a limit you can reduce to. So that's where the third part comes, which is about offsetting whatever you can't reduce. So, there, what we believe in an approach is an asset approach. We are building large agroforestry farms and we are creating them like a token, like a share. So, it's almost like you can own your own forest, and whatever you emit daily, that forest will absorb. So, it's like a balance sheet. I emit X, my forest absorbs Y, I'm in a net clean balance sheet, and I keep going throughout this cycle. And to give that to you, it's almost like I create a large forest, I break that into small shares like a sip, and you keep investing into that sip and then own that full forest over some period of time, right? And effectively get to net zero. So you do this for individuals, you do this for corporates, and in corporates you mainly do it for the scope 3, because scope 3 has the employee emissions, which is what we measure, and this is one of the most difficult thing also to measure. And our solution is more for people incentive companies like services, IT, and less for manufacturing and other things, because manufacturing also has other type of emissions which we do not measure. Right? So that's the broad lay of the land of what we do at Minzo. Measure, nudge to reduce, and whatever you cannot reduce, have your asset forest base to offset. A very small fact I will give you: before I did the whole study, I thought for somebody like me who flies a lot, getting to net zero will be a cost I can't even imagine. It's like I feel I'm like, while I'm climate conscious, I'm a big polluter. I could not believe that for a mere $3,500 or for about 3.5-4 lakhs, I can get to net zero today. That's all it takes. Right. So imagine the big corporations say, I will gonna make my senior management net zero, and every top firm decides to do that. It's not like you are asking for billions and trillions of dollars. It is a small contribution. We're talking about saying I pay for Spotify $10 or YouTube that amount of money. If I put half of that to build my forest space, I'm there, and I can lovingly live on this planet Earth with me and my next generations with a nice lifetime. I don't have to figure out Mars. And that's all it takes.
Right. Just to clarify one thing, so on the offset side, it's like buying into a share of an active carbon sink, essentially, right?
Yes. It is into a carbon sink and not a credit. Unfortunately, I don't believe in credits, because credits is something that has happened and it's tough to verify what is going. A carbon sink is something real. It is absorbing CO2 out right now as we speak. Right? Today, that can be plantations, it can be trees, agroforestry. Tomorrow, it can be direct to air capture or any other technology that is economically viable and available. Or for somebody who wants to say, I want to invest more, anything else as well. But it's a real time sink.
Right.
I wanted to sort of like check in with you, because I know you talked about like the difference of Minzo versus credits. And just to flesh out that model a little more, we're talking about different types of essentially forests that like you can own shares of. Could you also flesh out a little bit for us the not just because we've talked about sustainability from a climate change perspective through the entirety of this conversation, but that's not the only angle of climate change or sustainability. Sorry, climate change is not the only angle of sustainability that is vital to us. I mean, biodiversity, for example, is another critical topic, and we're talking about investing in forests. So could you talk to us and flesh out a little bit more about how this impacts some of these other issues, the sort of interconnected issues when we talk about sustainability and climate change?
So basically, while climate change is one part of it, you also have to understand that the resources on the earth are finite. For all people in Bangalore today, they realize water is such a pristine resource, right? You are running helter shelter to get a tanker, which now the government is controlling. So resources on this planet are finite. And what you need to do is you have to restore the original ecological balance, which needs an amount of green cover. And that's where having a forest base or an agroforestry base really helps. What's also important is you do this with a circular economy concept, right? Like, so how we do it is we actually give the saplings and the whole material to the farmers for free, and we say whatever it produces is yours. Now they have an incentive because of that to manage the trees or the plantation, because they want to produce out of it, right? It's their land. We don't take the land away from them. We said, this is your land, this we give you, all manure and all this thing we give you organically. You just manage it, keep the produce. The only thing we are getting a right for in return for that investment is whatever carbon it sinks goes back to the original investor. So that's the circular economy concept. It will keep going in circles and circles and circles again, because every party is benefited. The farmer is benefited because it's getting the produce. The investor is benefited because it's getting the carbon sink. And more concepts like this are needed in sustainability. For example, you see now in FMCG, a lot of the places people are doing this in terms of the farming techniques they do. And it not just helps them reduce their raw material cost by 20-30%, which is huge, but it just helps them make sustainability across their cycle.
I think you're
It's an
talking about
investment to start with.
regenerative farming
Yes.
as opposed to conventional farming,
Yes.
correct? Right.
Yes, in FMCG, that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of their, the raw material, the goods are goes back to the farming sources. So there's a lot of work that is happening there. Similarly, how waste, we look at waste, and in India, we're a little lucky to the sense that there's somebody or some unfortunate person who segregates our waste for us. But the importance of waste is very critical, because while we think that, yeah, you can keep dumping it and there's some landfill somewhere that will take it, uh, the recycling of that waste is critical, and ensuring that there's not enough non-regenerative plastic and other things that goes and gets buried is critical for that thing. So while temperature is one aspect, there are a lot of other aspects in terms of water, waste, agricultural practices that we need to be mindful of.
Right.
Exactly.
You talked about forestry and you talk about agroforestry, and we're talking about farmers as well. So could you just highlight very quickly the distinction between the two, and what it would look like?
Sure. So fair enough. Thank you for bringing back the basics. So, agroforestry is like saying you have a farm. Say take an example. You have a coffee plantation. That's one of our first agroforestry farm. On the side of the coffee plantation doesn't use the whole area, right? On the side of that coffee plantation, we have a full forest cover that has been built in. So trees have actually been planted. So the same patch has been used for one side of plantation, and then mango trees have been planted to the side of it. So that's like agroforestry. A simple forest cover can be something where you just take a patch of land and it's only forest. You only plant trees on it. So depending on the topography of an area, you can choose different concepts.
Something that Akshay and I have been thinking about over the last few years, given our work is in real estate, was that we've talked about this in many ways. Real estate as an industry is quite a big contributor to climate change related issues. We spoke to a recent guest about air quality related issues with real estate and dust as well. And wherever you look over the next 5 to 6 years till 2030, I think there's demand for millions and millions of square feet, residential, commercial, industrial, you name it, that needs to be constructed to meet the demand in India. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask you, given that kind of growth in terms of construction is a given, what are some of the interventions or maybe process changes that could reduce the impact from the real estate industry, from a planning perspective, also from a material use perspective, also maybe, I don't know.
So I think it's very critical to consider this for real estate, because our buildings and real estate itself is one of the major contributors. Almost not the 30% comes just from that one source, and we can't go away from it. But thinking about it upfront, more in the perspective of saying, how do I build something which is energy efficient? How do I design it itself in a way that I don't need to have hundreds of lights and I can use more natural light? I don't need to put too many heatings or ACs. I can have natural air cooling or insulation. So smart systems in that way is the first step that you need from the design angle itself, even before the building has been put up. Once the design is done, you need to think about the construction part in terms of, can I use sustainable materials? Today there are talks about saying how I get away from large cement to 3D fabricated buildings, which are way more sustainable and quicker to put up, right? So there is a whole worth there in terms of sustainable building. Then after that comes sustainable um, in equipment inside it. How do I not put a normal bulb but a low energy consuming LED bulb or something like that, or high star rating ACs, heaters, stuff like that? And how do I power my building? Do I buy renewable off the grid, or do I actually put my own integrated solar panels, geothermal panels, or stuff like that. So there is a lot of things that can be done there. And what people have to understand is that while building a green building may be an upfront investment, it's the same thing. You have to look at it in a long term horizon. In longer term, it's going to give you much more impact and benefit and return on your investment than not doing it. And you can follow multiple green building standards and just increase the value of your building for even the residents staying there.
Right.
So it's something that has to come as a combination from the designer to the constructor to the equipment provider and then to the user to ensure, oh, I have a green building, I'll leave all lights open. That
Hmm.
doesn't help, right?
Right.
What about a smart lighting system where it's automatic? I enter it, it starts, and it automatically closes away.
Right. And I think you mentioned something really important there. It's that, it's there has to be a kind of, it has to be in the public consciousness, the user and the consumer of these products also. There has to be a bit of ground up kind of initiative taken from there. So with that in mind, we spoke about Minzo's offerings today. And another just follow up I had was we've talked about the tracking issue, right? You talked about maybe including purchases in the future. And there's also a mitigation solution that you're offering in terms of a carbon sink or agroforestry. So with that in mind, I just wanted to ask you about the future of Minzo. Do you see any other offerings that you'd like to maybe expand into, or some vertical, like you said, the tracking vertical can be explored deeper with purchases? Any future initiatives that you have in mind?
Sure. So definitely the purchases is something. What I believe I genuinely want to do is build a sustainable marketplace to say, if I want to buy sustainable goods, this is the place I will come to. I know
Right.
whatever I'm getting here is climate friendly,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And I want to build an idea bag of climate tech that people who have genuinely done things without completely changing their lives learn from them. Because I have a fundamental belief climate change is not about completely disrupting your life. It's about bringing subtle, small changes and adding them up. And what best to learn from each other to say, oh, what works best in this geography? What works best for this age group? Right. So, those are the two things I would love to add on to Minzo, a group chat or a group community, like a Reddit of climate and an Amazon of sustainable goods.
Hmm. Given the amount of time I spend on Reddit, or Reddit for climate action would be quite a good initiative, I think. Perfect. I think that brings us to the end of the questions that we had for you today, Tanya. From both Akshay and I just wanted to say thank you so much for educating us on potential climate actions that we can do as well, and letting us know a little bit more about the industry and the processes at large.
Yeah. Thank you so
Sure.
much.
Thank you. Thank you, Akshay. Really appreciate it. And I hope it was worth for the listeners.
Definitely. Thank you for checking out Concrete Conversations, the Indian real estate podcast. Check us out on Instagram for more short form content and highlights from our episodes. And if you have any questions, do comment on the video and let us know, and we'll try to answer them in an upcoming episode.